Welcome to MarsCast, the official podcast of Mid-America Reformed Seminary, where faculty and friends explore the depths of faith, unpack biblical truth, and engage with the critical issues of our time. I'm Jared Luchabor. Thank you for tuning in. In this fourth installment of exploring John Calvin's teachings on the Christian life, Dr. J. Mark Beach examines Calvin's practical wisdom on how believers should engage with the present world and its blessings. Drawing from Book 3, Chapter 10 of Calvin's Institutes, Dr. Beach unpacks Calvin's balanced approach between asceticism and excess, showing how Christians can properly enjoy God's good gifts while maintaining spiritual focus and faithful stewardship.
We have been looking at Book 3 of Calvin's Institutes, chapters 6, 7, 8, 9, and now with this broadcast, number 10. And we're going to conclude with number 10, which says how we must use the present life and its helps. Now think of Christian life. Most people are interested in that topic. If you talk about Christian spirituality and things of that nature, people have an interest. Calvin, at the beginning of this set of chapters, says, look, I'm only sketching things. I'm only offering a brief outline. He talks about church fathers who wrote big extended treatises on this. Many Reformed believers, theologians after Calvin have written rather fat books on Christian living and Christian warfare and all sorts of things that fit under those categories. Calvin knows this topic can be handled at great length, but he's giving us a sketch. And as I earlier noted, these chapters of Calvin, which I can't do any justice to, by the way, I'm just sketching out things. And I can't talk and express this the way Calvin does in his eloquence of language. But because it's so loved, once again, these chapters have from time to time been lifted out of the Institutes and published as a separate book. So some of you have maybe even read the golden booklet of the True Christian Life, and then more recently, a republication of these chapters under the title On the Christian Life, a new translation from Crossway. So I commend those books to you, but even more than that, I commend the Institutes to you again. And if you can find your way and time, maybe on Sunday afternoons, to discipline yourself, to work your way through Calvin's Institutes, you'd be much benefited by that and blessed, I'm sure. Now with chapter 10, yes, how, as part of Christian living, how we must use the present life and its helps. Well, the call for meditation upon the future life, as we saw last time, doesn't mean that Calvin rejects creation. In fact, he doesn't. He has a high doctrine of creation. His piety is not otherworldly in that certain pietist, otherworldly sense, as if the material is to be fled and is by nature sinful. Calvin directs us to enjoy the good things of this life as God's gifts to us. However, we do need instruction in the right use of these kinds of gifts of God to us. So to live a Christian life and to order a Christian life well, you need to know how to use those blessings necessary for living, which, whether it's a necessity for whether they're gifts of necessity or gifts of delight, some things we just have to have, daily bread necessities, but others are much more over and above what we merely need. Well, how do we use? Perhaps we are wealthier than other people, not just very wealthy people, just middle-class people. We're doing well for ourselves. How do we use the present life and the blessings that accompany it? Well, first, Calvin would say, don't forget you're pilgrims. You're on a pilgrimage. So this earth, with its fallenness, with the sinners that fill it, with its living under the sway of the devil, is not your heavenly home. It's not the heavenly kingdom. it will know a transformation that way, but it's not yet that. So the principle Calvin lays down for using this life and its gifts is really first to warn us away from two errors. First, to escape asceticism, and then the second, intemperance. So asceticism is to be too severe, taste not, touch not, handle not, go without, minimalist living, or a very split-natured kind of living that everything else is unworthy and undesirable, but only spiritual things are worthy and desirable. The second error, intemperance, gives way to unbridled excess. Asceticism, the first error, puts conscience in chains. So advocates of this will argue for a life that's austere, only the necessary things. To them, says Calvin, necessity means to abstain from all things that they could do without. Thus, according to them, it would scarcely be permitted to add any food at all to plain bread and water. No peanut butter and jam on that bread. You can just have the bread. Intemperance, or a kind of licentiousness, leaves the conscience, this is the other error, leaves the conscience without limits or regulation. It's unchecked indulgence. There's no guidelines. It's a free-for-all. So Calvin argues that we're to use the Lord's gifts by directing them to the end and to the use for which he created them. So quoting Calvin here, he says this, "Now if we ponder to what end God created food, we shall find that he meant not only to provide for necessity, but also for delight and joy, good cheer. Thus the purpose of clothing, apart from necessity, was comeliness and decency. In grasses, trees, and fruits, apart from their various uses, there's beauty of appearance and pleasantness of odor." Writes Calvin, "Has the Lord clothed the flowers with the great beauty that greets our eyes, the sweetness of smell that's wafted upon our nostrils? And yet will it be unlawful for our eyes to be affected by that beauty, or our sense of smell by the sweetness of that odor? What? Did he not so distinguish colors as to make some more lovely than others? What? Did he not endow gold and silver, ivory and marble with loveliness that renders them more precious than other metals or stones? Did he not, in short, render many things attractive to us apart from their necessary use?" Calvin is not a utilitarian. Mere utility is not a correct use of God's gifts. Yes, God is creative. God delights in the arts. He himself is an artist. There is more to life than just an austere usefulness, mere necessity, getting by, scrimping by. No. For Calvin, a Christian life, how we must use the present life, the Christian life, he's aware that there's both sides of the error. So there's the asceticism error, which he's attacked, now the intemperance error. And he knows that we succumb to the lusts of the flesh. He knows that we gorge ourselves at banquets and become conceited with our apparel. He knows that some people are allured by material things so that they have no sense of or an appetite for spiritual things. They're living it up so well now, who cares about eternity, forgetting how temporal even a rich life is. And that such people walk a path of ingratitude. We must heed the apostles' warning, says Calvin, to resist the abuse of God's good gifts of creation, and especially to make no provision for the flesh and to satiate its wicked desires. So both errors are to be fought off. If we're to be spiritually minded people in the proper way, as part of the Christian life, We must learn a certain contempt, as we saw before, for the present life, and a treasuring of the heavenly immortality to come. But here too, Calvin offers two rules to help us out. Those who use this world should be so affected as if they did not use it. And those who marry, he's quoting Paul, 1 Corinthians 7:29 and following. And those who marry as if they didn't marry, and those who buy as if they didn't buy. That's the apostles' rule. And the other rule is that we as Christians should know how to bear poverty peaceably and patiently, as well as to bear abundance moderately. Well, he urges that these two rules deliver us from different sorts and sets of sins. So this set of sins, pertaining to the first rule, it destroys the intemperance of gluttony. And by that, just all excessiveness in all things, whether it's dining or buildings or furnishing or clothing, or it's excessiveness of arrogance or over fastidiousness or pride or ambition. This applies to all kinds of people, including theological professors. We also destroy with this rule all the daily cares of life that keep us from contemplating our heavenly life and getting our souls prepared. So Calvin offers this tenet to guide us, to indulge oneself as little as possible. How about living that way? But on the contrary, with unflagging effort of mind, to insist upon cutting off all show of superfluous wealth, not to mention licentiousness, and diligently to guard against turning helps into hindrances. Okay, so you have abundance, you have many gifts, perhaps you have wealth, perhaps you have a comfortable life. That's fine, but you don't have to show off. And then you can also learn how to use these things not as hindrances to you, but as helps to you and helps to others. Now, going back to the second rule, which is to bear poverty peaceably and patiently and abundance moderately, he says this rule helps exercise patience when we know want, and to bear abundance in this moderation. And so we'll make considerable progress in the Lord's school of faith if we actually make this a practice. Persons who begrudge their poverty, what happens to them? If they know prosperity, they're boasters and conceited about it. People who are ashamed of their mean clothing will boast if they have costly clothing, elegant clothing, the designer brands, the status brands. People who are not content with their ordinary pasta meal, to update the language here, will be troubled by the desire for an eloquent meal at a restaurant. But then if they should have that, they'll be conceited about having it. They'll be intemperate, not temperate. They'll abuse the blessings. So if we grumble at meagerness, we'll be arrogant in abundance. But if we learn contentment, as Philippians 4:12 tells us, we'll learn the better way. We'll learn to make the right use of the blessings we have now. So let us embrace, as Calvin, sobriety and frugality and moderation, even abstinence. Moreover, we must be good stewards of gifts that God has bestowed upon us. For many of us, these are themes that we were raised with as part of Christian living, and now you know where they come from, at least within a Reformed context. Calvin is our original teacher of these things that has been passed down. Good habits, but how are we losing them is a good question. So finally, to close out this whole series on Calvin and the Christian life, Calvin instructs every believer to be faithful to their calling, their vocation, Every individual, he says, has a kind of living assigned to him by the Lord, a sentry post that he holds. And he's not to wander from that. He's to take his station and task up with all seriousness and not grumble about it, but see that God has put him into a labor before his face here. Quoting Calvin in order to close out this whole section about faithful living in your vocation, he says this: "It will be no slight relief from cares, labors, troubles, and other burdens for a man to know that God is his guide in all things. The magistrate will discharge his functions more willingly. The head of the household will confine himself to his duty. Each man will bear and swallow the discomforts, vexations, weariness, and anxieties in this way of life. When he's been persuaded, when he's persuaded that the burden was laid upon him by God, from this will also arise a singular consolation, that no task will be so sordid and base, provided you obey your calling in it, that it will not shine and be reckoned very precious in God's sight." In other words, you also live a Christian life in your daily vocational life before God's face to his honor and glory.
As we face our own struggles with consumerism and materialism, Calvin's call to moderation and faithful stewardship really reminds us that we can enjoy God's gifts while keeping our hearts set on eternal things. So whether in times of abundance or scarcity, we're urged to find contentment in God's provision and to use our resources and vocations for His glory. Consider your own attitudes towards possessions and pleasures. Are you practicing moderation and gratitude? Do you see your work as a calling from God? Like I said last time, I think Calvin's pastoral guidance invites us to live intentionally as pilgrims in this world, while still appreciating the good gifts our Father in heaven provides. Well, stay tuned as our podcast shifts focus to explore another crucial topic for contemporary Christians, and that is the ongoing debates around Christian nationalism. Dr. Alan Strange joined me as we examine different perspectives within Reformed circles and unpack the theological and practical implications of this important discussion. Thank you for your continued support of Mid-America Reformed Seminary and this show. And remember to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. I'm Jared Luchabor. This has been an episode of MarsCast. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.